Hello, welcome to the second edition of A Peek Behind the Curtain with myself, Anthony Peake. Random musings of a peculiar mind, I think I'm probably going to call it. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject that has interested me over the years. And in fact, it's a subject that I wasn't even aware existed until comparatively recently. And it's the phenomenon, there's two strains to this. It's a phenomenon, or probably, I suppose, a basis of philosophy or something called hauntology, and also folk horror. And both of these things are very much linked. And not only are they linked, but they seem to link quite distinctly to the part of the world I come from, the Wirral, on Merseyside. Now, I'll make some links to that later. But I'm just going to randomly associate here a little bit about the background to hauntology. Hauntology was first put forward, I think it was in 1993, by Jacques Derrida, who is a French philosopher. And Derrida came up with the term hauntology, which is a really very clever play on words. Because what it is, it's a portmanteau word. That is a word that links two words together. And it's haunt, which is haunting and everything else being haunted in one way or another, and ontology, which is the philosophy of being, of who I am, what I am, that kind of thing. And he brought the two together and created the word hauntology. But it's cleverer than that, because in French, the H isn't sounded. So hauntology, as it is written, is pronounced ontology. So here we have a word that is ontology, which is changed to hauntology, but the letter that changes it is silent, which means it continues being ontology. And I thought that was a very, very clever way of getting the idea across. But what exactly do we mean by hauntology? Well, it's the idea that we are in some way haunted by our perceptions of the past, or more importantly, how we, when we were in the past, believed the future to be, if that makes any sense. It's the idea of the looking back to films and movies such as, I don't know, one that springs to mind straight away, I think, in terms of the way the future was thought to be in the 1930s, was the film version of the H.G. Wells novel, The Shape of Things to Come, which I remember affecting me quite a lot when I was a child. And I remember seeing it on TV. And it also reminded me of the world of the late 1950s when we had TV series such as Buck Rogers and various other TV series coming over from America. There was an idea of what the future was going to be like. And there was this feeling of great optimism as to the future, and everybody was going to be wandering around in togas and things, and that type of thing. But the fact of the matter is the future didn't pan out that way. It's panned out in a very different way. And in fact, now we don't tend to look forward to the future in the way we used to. We seem to have this attachment to the future as we wanted it to be, rather than the future than it is. And this means in many ways that we feel that history or the progression of time seem to stop somewhere in, I think people tend to place it probably in the late 80s, when we seem to lose our looking forward to the future, which of course is strange, isn't it? Because the world we live in now is so similar in many ways to the world that I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, but is also different in so many ways, because we couldn't have ever envisaged the technological revolution that electronics has brought to us, the way in which, the internet and everything else as well, and the way in which we can communicate now instantaneously. And in many ways, it does feel as if we're almost living in, as there's been said many times, a Philip K. Dick novel, in that I remember in one Philip K. Dick book, I can't remember which it was now, they had papes, which were kind of newspapers that you could read electronically. And again, we have them now, and we take them for granted. We have iPads, we have instantaneous communication. we also live in a world that really has certain elements of the past. I mean, again, I'm reminded, I think there was a sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I went to see about 1968-69. And in that, I think two of the characters, the two characters that relate with Hal in the final sequence of the movie, and they again have, when they're having lunch one day, they're actually reading things, and they look like iPads. So we are kind of living in a future, but it's not the future that we expected it to be. And this means that we now have this looking back on the past in a different way. And it's particularly when you apply then hauntology to movies and novels and everything else. And there is this longing back, particularly in the UK. I mean, this is probably not going to work as well for any of you that are based in the United States, and particularly some of you that probably are younger than me, but probably the people who grew up in the 70s and 80s will remember these even more. And it's the way in which there were certain TV programs and films and movies that seemed to hark back to a lost England, England or Britain, I suppose. And they were films that usually were based in the past or had a theme that catapulted people into the past. Now, again, when I was younger, and I know that, they say about the haunted generation, but a lot of the things I'm going to mention now, I will guarantee that people of my age and maybe slightly younger will immediately respond to and say, yes, I remember that. For instance, I remember way back in the mid 1960s, there was a TV film that was shown based upon the story of Alice in Wonderland, done by Jonathan Miller, who was a very popular, quite avant-garde filmmaker in the 1960s. And if anybody's ever seen that version of Alice in Wonderland, it is very, very disturbing. It's like a dream nightmare. It's made in black and white, and the actress that plays Alice in Wonderland, her delivery and her acting style is incredibly flat, but kind of real in some way. And she kind of talks to herself, because in Alice in Wonderland there is this inner dialogue that Alice has with herself, and she talks to herself about things that she sees and everything else as well. And it has this sense of really being surreal. And there's one particularly disturbing sequence where Alice, I think, has just had the Mad Hatter's tea party, and the Queen of Hearts, I think it is, her group of courtiers and her band and everything are coming towards Alice. And as they're coming towards Alice, you can hear the sound in the distance. And then you see them coming towards her, but they don't come towards her straight away. They do it in kind of jumps. 1 minute they seem to be about half a mile away, then they're 3/4 of a mile away, then they're half a mile, and they get closer and closer to her. But they do it in jumps, almost like quantum physics and quantum leaping and quantum jumping. It's really quite strange, and it very much disturbed me. And I then recalled a similar device being used. They used to do ghost stories for Christmas, which were based upon usually the stories of M.R. James, I think it's M.R. James anyway. My mind has let me down on this one. But he was a Cambridge Don. And every Christmas he would do tell a story to his fellow Dons. And it was nearly always based in East Anglia, usually the Suffolk coast. And his stories were always just curious And in fact, one of his stories was called A Warning to the Curious. And what would normally happen is that an object would be found, a kind of an archaeological object. The central character would find something, and this object would manifest itself in different ways subconsciously within the worldview of the central character, normally a loner. And these became very popular, and in the 1960s they did a series of Christmas tales based upon these. And one of them was called Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And again, in that particular film, it's filmed in stark black and white. And it was based, I've subsequently found it was based in Felixstowe. And again, the central character just finds a whistle, a buried whistle. And he blows it, and by doing so, he brings forth this chthonic force that has been waiting to become alive again. And I won't ruin the storyline for you because I think you can watch these on YouTube, but it is profoundly disturbing. And there's one particular sequence where the central character is on a winter's beach, again Felixstowe or somewhere in the Suffolk coastline, Dunwich possibly, and again there is an object which you see almost in the corner of your eye and his eye, and it's a person shape. And again, it does the same kind of Alice in Wonderland effect where it gets bigger and bigger as it gets closer and closer. And I remember that disturbing me very much. But I became interested in the M.R. James, and they did a lot of other of his stories, all of which were good. But again, in the mid-1960s, there was a TV series, which unfortunately a lot of them were lost because they were either recorded live, but they weren't recorded onto videotape or anything, called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And I think a guy called Buck used to do the presentations, I think. There was always a guy that would introduce the stories. Now, initially, from the Tales of Mystery and Imagination, a lot of them were based upon an American writer, who again has escaped me. I'm getting old, it's terrible, isn't it, really? But they're based upon a lot of his writings. But the other stories were M.R. James's stories. And a number of them were done in that format. And one of them was called the Tractate Midoth. And in my mind's eye, the most evocative image of this is this ghost, come cadaver for want of a better term, that's wandering the university library at Cambridge. And his face is full of cobwebs. And the Tractate Midoth apparently is some ancient oracle, some kind of black magic grimoire or something that he's searching for. Edgar Allan Poe, by the way, was the writer in question. And again, that imagery stuck in my mind. But at that time, and over the years, I'd never really thought a great deal about it. But it seems that a lot of other people also remember these. And I then recall going back further to Nigel Neal? Again, because I'm doing this live, it's all off the top of my head, so some of these things may be incorrect, but I think it was Nigel Neal, who did a series of TV one-off programs with the central character of Quatermass. And the first Quatermass one, again, I think was one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen on television. And it's a guy who comes back from space and he's brought some kind of illness back with him. And you see him morph into something else. Something else takes him over. And again, because he has this stark black and whiteness about it, it's particularly intimate and terrifying. But then they did another Quatermass story called Quatermass and the Pit. And Quatermass and the Pit was particularly interesting because of the themes it uses. And it uses the idea there's a place in London where I think they're building an extension to the tube line, the underground. And I think they come across an object that seems to have there's a kind of a force field around it or something. And they go into it and they find the mummified bodies of insectoid aliens. And these aliens have been there for about 3 million years. But the interesting thing is that the location of the dig is called Hobbs Lane. And it's called Hobbs Lane as in hobgoblin and the name of the devil. So clearly there had been manifestations of entities around that area for hundreds of years. And it was all to do with this buried spaceship. And it's again then to do with the nature of evil and the nature of how our minds can be influenced because the aliens manifest in some way and they take over the minds of people. And the central argument in this is, about the sense of evil, the way in which we do bad things to each other. And of course, in the mid-1950s, late 1950s, the horrors of the Second World War were still very, very common in people's minds. And this is a theme that comes through in this. And then, of course, from then you move on to the early Doctor Who's. And one of the Doctor Who's, which is particularly of interest to me because of the title of it, called The Daemons. And these, again, are beings that are like goblins that manifest within the Doctor Who universe. This is, again, the original Doctor Who from the 1970s, I think this would have been. But then we start looking at their TV series, but there were also a lot of other, when we got into the 1960s, there were also a number of other fascinating TV programs based upon similar themes. And one that I was particularly interested in is The Owl Service, which was a novel written by Alan Garner, again, I think in the 1960s. Now, Alan Garner is somebody that's always fascinated me. He wrote a series of books, and in fact, recently he's written a new novel, which I think is due out soon, and I think he's well into his 80s now. But Alan Garner is a fascinating guy because he was writing almost in the style of Tolkien in many ways, but modernised, but also with a sense of the past. And his novels are normally based around in Cheshire, or the Marches, the borderlands between Cheshire and Wales. And much of his stories are actually based upon a village called Alderley Edge. And indeed, I lived in Alderley Edge for three and a half years in the mid-1980s, when I had a job relocation up to Manchester and I was commuting in every day. And I found Alderley Edge a particularly strange place. At that time, I'd never heard of Alan Garner. I discovered him because people I knew in the pub started to talk about him and said, do you know that Alan Garner occasionally drinks in this particular pub? And the pub in question was called the De Trafford Arms. And again, I'm going off on a tangent here, so forgive me, but this is the whole point of this. The De Trafford Arms was quite an interesting pub in the sense it sat at the bottom of Alderley Edge, the Alderley Edge Hill. Alderley Edge is this incredible rock sandstone outcrop that overlooks the Cheshire Plain. And the edge itself is full of tunnels, Neolithic tunnels, and old mine workings, which again somebody I'd met at the in the pub knew of somebody who could get us access to the tunnels, and indeed one evening myself and 2 or 3 others went into the tunnels underneath the edge, which are locked. You can't go in there. There's a potholing club that does it there, but because they are so dangerous, you have to be taken round by a guide. And again, that was an extraordinary experience. But when I was there, you have this sense, again, going on about the feeling of hauntology, going on about the feeling of the past coming into the present. I very much sensed that whenever I was on Alderley Edge. Now, again, what is fascinating about Alderley Edge is there is a restaurant come pub halfway up the edge called, sounds good, isn't it, halfway up the edge? It sounds like Close to the Edge by Yes, which I'll probably talk about at some stage in the future, the album. But there is a place called The Wizard. And again, it's to do with the legend of the Wizard of Alderley Edge. And not only that, but there's a legend that says that King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are asleep inside Alderley Edge, inside the rock outcrop. And what will happen is that when England is in its greatest danger, they will come out and they will go down the hill and they'll rescue England from whoever the bad guys are. And I used to sit in the pub in the D Trafford Arms thinking, I hope it doesn't happen when I'm here, because what's going to happen is the Knights of the Round Table are going to come crashing straight through this pub en route to wherever they're going, because there's no other way. You had to come down the edge. There was no other route, and they'd go crashing through the pub. So I thought, I wonder if they'd stop for a pint on the way, which again is an interesting thought. But going back to the owl service, it's a children's story or a young adult story. And that's what makes it particularly curious and strange. Now, the novel itself works very, very well. But the TV series, or the TV version of it, which I think was in the 1973, I think, has this incredibly otherworldly feel about it, which is very difficult to describe. And it's modern. It's set in modern times. But the characters, there's something again with the past breaking through. And it's called the Owl Service because there are noises in the loft of this cottage that the young adults are staying in Wales. And when they go upstairs, they found a tea service with plates and everything else as well, with pictures of owls on them. And that's where the term the Owl Service comes from. And they bring these plates down, but there's obviously something being manifest by these objects. Now, I won't again ruin the story for you, so you need to watch it, but it is worth watching because it, again, just for this kind of timeless hauntology feel. And again, hauntology and the subject I'm talking about now is very much, as I said, to do with the relationship between what we have and the past through the countryside. And it very much gives the English countryside as a threat. It's not the English countryside as something bucolic and attractive. It's something that underneath lies great danger. There is something deeply dangerous about it. And very much this comes across in a number of the other things I'm going to be talking about now. But again, from the Wirral link, I thought I recognised vaguely the house that they filmed the Owl Service in. Now, as I said, it was supposed to be based in mid-Wales, somewhere near the Baddock Estuary, I think. But the house I vaguely recognised. So I checked it up, and I was astonished to discover that the house they filmed it in is in Bebington, which is my hometown on the Wirral. And not only that, but the house they filmed it is owned by a guy called, a family called the Lancelin Greens. And Lancelin Green himself was quite a famous writer of his time. And again, he wrote about mythology and such like. And one of the particular areas of interest that he wrote about was a tale called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, again, was based on Wirral. Now, Wirral itself has this kind of curious timelessness. When you get out into the countryside, you have this strange feeling. I mean, there's urban areas and everything, but there's these kind of strange places. And indeed, quite a few novels have been written based upon this kind of otherworldliness that you have on Wirral as well. And then the link started to really fall into place because I started to look into other films that are in the hauntological mode. And a film that I had been interested in for many years but had never seen is called Penda's Fen. And Penda's Fen is slightly later. And it's a very, very, very strange film. It's about a guy, probably he's 15 or 16. And he's an outsider. His father is a vicar or a minister, and he goes to this local grammar school which is reminds me very much of my old grammar school. It's very house orientated and everything else as well. And I think I know why that is the case, but I'll come back to that in a second. The kid starts to have hallucinations. He's coming of age. He's not sure of his sexuality. He's being beaten up at school and everything, and he's been told he doesn't really necessarily fit in school. And he starts to go walking in the countryside around, and it's near the Malvern Hills, so a lot of the filming of it, you can see the Malvern Hill Ridge in the distance, which gives it again this kind of otherworldly quality. But he starts to evoke the past, and he realizes that Penda's fen, there's a King Penda who was this pre-Christian pagan king who lived in the area, and Penda starts to manifest in his life. He starts to see him there. He starts to hear voices and everything else as well. So it has this incredible strangeness about it again. But interestingly enough, again, checking up, and I discovered that the director of this was a guy called Alan Clark. And Alan Clark had done a series, and subsequently did a series of quite famous TV plays in Play for Today. But I then discovered he comes from Wirral, and if anybody's interested, again, if there's any English people here, particularly people who follow the BBC Sport, there used to be a BBC sports broadcaster called Gabriel Clark, and that apparently is Alan Clark's son. So Alan Clark again, and coming from the Wirral, and I just wonder, I think he came from Wallasey. But I know that Wirral is a strange place in that they still have their grammar schools. And I know that Wallasey Grammar School was very much on the lines of my school, which was Wirral Grammar School. And again, they had houses. And again, this feeling comes across within Penda's fen. So here we have these kind of strange plays that were on British television in the 60s and 70s. And there are other ones that are well worth checking out, such as the Stone Tapes, the Children of the Stones, and all these ones. The Children of the Stones, basically is based in Avebury, where again there's a linkage with the past through the megalithic stones, and the stone tapes again is something which is an application of what's called the stone tape theory, which is the idea that sounds and events can be recorded by the stones around you. Again, I think this is probably an application of Wilhelm Reich's orgone energy. The idea that, well, for instance, you've probably experienced it yourself when you walk into a room and people have been arguing. You know it, you sense it. There is this kind of tension in the air that you can't describe, and it's not to do with body language. It's something more visceral, something more basic within our abilities to pick up vibrations. Now, if you apply the concept of orgone energy, which is one of the things that Wilhelm Reich was interested in, and again, to go off on the tangent, if any of you guys are Kate Bush fans, and you know the video of her song Cloud Bursting, which has Kate Bush in it, and the Canadian actor who was in Don't Look Now, whose name will come to me in a second. That was based upon the work of Wilhelm Reich, because Wilhelm Reich believed that he also was able to create using certain machinery to create rain. But suffice to say, that's the aside there. So rolling back now to I don't know where I've now gone with this now in terms of the subject I was talking about, just rolling back. So we have Wilhelm Reich, the stone tape theory, that's it. So they then applied this idea and said, well, could it be this is what is taking place when people see ghosts or hear ghosts? Because an awful lot of hauntings tend to, and again, hauntology, tend to involve sounds, as if the sounds are being recreated. And even sometimes the visuals are being recreated from the environment around them. For instance, I'm always fascinated by the famous, I think it was the Dieppe landings, way back in about the 1950s. Sometime there was two ladies who were staying in a hotel in Dieppe in France, and they were woken up in the night with the sound of gunfire and screams and shouts and everything. And they lived through the Dieppe landings that took place in the Second World War. So could it be, again, the sounds were recreated because the atmospheric conditions were just right to generate this kind of atmosphere? And of course, even if you go back to the 1905 Mrs. Moberly and Jourdan, the famous incident in Versailles, where they supposedly had a time slip back to the reign of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, that would have been Louis XVI, I guess, because Marie Antoinette was there. And again, they initially thought that they were viewing a play that was taking place, but it wasn't. They seem to have gone back in time. So again, there seems to be this kind of, when certain atmospheres take place, it recreates things in one way or another. And in the Stone tapes, this is exactly what is going on, where a group of scientists who are doing recording, I think they're making music recordings or something in an old studio, and they suddenly start hearing sounds, and they realise the sounds are actually imbued into the stones around them. And again, it gets quite creepy and very, very disturbing, very well worth checking out. But moving on now very quickly, so that's some of the plays and some of the TV programs that were involved. But there was also what's called the three famous British hauntology folk horror movies that really stuck in people's minds in the most powerful way. Two of them are still very popular now, and one of them is lesser known. And it was the one that was lesser known that I really focused in on in my checking up on hauntology and such like. And it's a film called Blood on the Devil's Claw. And I'd heard about it before. And indeed, many, many years ago, when I watched the film, I had this incredible feeling of recognition of one of the scenes. And I thought, I know that place. And I recall feeling very disturbed about it when I saw it. And I'm just wondering if I can find it here. I don't know if No, I haven't. But it was a kind of a wrecked church, stone church, flint church, in the Chiltern Hills. And I used to regularly, in the early 1980s, I regularly every Sunday used to do walks in the Chiltern Hills, which are a chalk outcrop to the west of London, the other side of the airport running towards Oxfordshire. Very beautiful part of the world. But again, a part of the world that's kind of laden with strangeness. In fact, the Chiltern Hills features a lot in movies. I mean, I'm thinking of, for instance, probably there's a village called Turville, which a lot of people will recognise because it's the Christmas village in the opening sequence of, I think it's Bridget Jones' Diary, where he ends up with the jumper and the Christmas presents and things. But it's a beautiful area, very picture box, but it has again this feeling of the past. And I think there are certain places in England particularly that have this feeling. And this is why Blood on Satan's Claw is so powerful, because it's filmed in the Chilterns. So you have this kind of otherworldliness about the Chilterns. And it's a film that is based in the early 18th century. So you're talking probably the reign of Queen Anne, maybe. So you're talking, about 1720, 1730, something like that. Maybe later, actually, because there's a curious reference in it to The King Across the Water by one of the characters, which leads me to believe that it is to do with, that would have been the old Pretender, the Stuart line. So it probably could have been the early Hanoverians, but suffice to say. What happens is that it starts with somebody, again, this trope of the lost and found object, where this guy is ploughing his field, and he finds within it there is this kind of skull with an eye, which quite disturbs him. And he goes back and tells the local bailiff or whoever he is that he's found something strange in the field, and they go out and it's disappeared. And he swears that he saw it. And what you discover is that he's uncovered this, again, evil force that's in the ground that starts to manifest, and it drives one young woman insane, and she goes mad over it. And then there is a group of young children, and it's very disturbing how these young children, who are supposedly quasi-religious, for the religion of that period, but they become very controlled by whatever the entity is. And the entity is trying to recreate itself out of flesh. So it needs flesh from other people to grow itself, as it were. And there are one or two really there's a brutal rape that takes place in it. And there's also really horrific sequences, most of which take place in the church that I was talking about, that I had the strange feeling about all those years ago. And I swear that I did not know that Blood on Satan's Claw had been filmed, and in fact I didn't even know that the film Blood on Satan's Claw existed. So there was that kind of sense of strangeness. Now again, it's quite fascinating how the film was filmed, and it's very low angled. All of the film sequences are almost from ground level, as if you get the feeling that you're rising up from the ground all the time. You're seeing it from a particular angle, which I think again is quite fascinating as to how that's done. So that's one film that's worth checking out, Blood on Satan's Claw. It's okay. It's not badly acted, I have to say, but it just has a kind of a timelessness about it. And then we move on to the other film that was also produced, I think, by the same company, which I think was Tygon. And this film is probably the most depressing, psychologically horrific film you'll ever see. Not because of the scenes of horror particularly, the scenes of horror are awful. It's very much the sense of threat and hopelessness. And it's called Witchfinder General. And it takes place, 1640, 45, 44. And it's towards the end of the English Civil War. And it's in Suffolk. Again, Suffolk, the same Suffolk of M.R. James. And it starts like a standard... Well, it doesn't. The starting is actually quite weird. The starting, you see a group of people going through a village. And they look like they're kind of dancing, or the celebrants, and there's a priest with them. And in that sequence, I'm reminded of, if anybody remembers the video, Men with Hats, the something dance, I can't remember, but it's got that same kind of feel to it, because that is a strange video. Check it out if you can. It's called Men with Hats, and it's the something dance. But anyway, check it out. It's available on YouTube. But these people come walking forward, and you realise there's a woman being dragged. And you realise now what the opening sequence is about, because the very opening sequence, you see you're looking out to this bucolic countryside, and you hear this knocking sound. And then it zooms in, and there's a man putting the finishing touches to a hanging thing, a gallows. And you realise that the woman that's being talked through is a witch that's going to be hung. And it's horrific because she's screaming and she's being dragged. And they hang her, they drop her off and they hang her. And of course, it's quite a peculiar thing because she dies instantaneously, but she's not dropped, which is slightly weird, but that's a vague criticism of it. But you then discover that around and about is a guy called Matthew Hopkins. And Matthew Hopkins is the Witchfinder General. And he and his assistant go from village to village, seeking out witches and burning them to death, and helping the locals get rid of witches. So there's this kind of paranoia taking place. But because, of course, at that time, the England was in chaos. There was virtual anarchy. The Civil War was coming to an end, but anarchy was everywhere, and religious intolerance was at the fore, because what was happening was, particularly in East Anglia and Suffolk, there was a particularly malignant form of Puritanism that was there, that was very, very nasty in many, many ways, and lots of witches had been burned at the stake, and all kinds of things happened. And Matthew Hopkins, who was a lawyer, had realised that here was the opportunity to make some money, because he charged people for it. And he'd come into a town and he'd test whether, there was the devil's spot where you stick a pin in, and if the person doesn't feel pain, that is obviously that's the devil's spot, and that would be enough to condemn you. But of course, it was people's opportunities to put to death people they didn't like in one way or another, which is exactly what happens in the film. But as the film develops, you realise that Matthew Hopkins is a real danger. And again, I won't spoil it for you, but watch it for the atmosphere. Watch it again for the feeling of threat within the countryside. What looks like a lovely bucolic place is just full of dangers, and how humanity can really be awful. I mean, again, I know the places quite well, again, having lived in various areas around the country. I know that area quite well. And a lot of the sequences were filmed in a place called Manningtree, which is in fact just in Essex, but nevertheless is the same part of the world. And also the major witch burnings took place in the locations they took place. So that what makes the film even more disturbing is that you are seeing them, the incidents in the locations they took place. Well worth watching, checking out if you've not seen it before. And the third of the trilogy of great folk horror films is The Wicker Man. Now, The Wicker Man, again, plays with a lot of very interesting themes in terms of the countryside again. But this time, the location is not England, it's Scotland. And its location is a place called Summer Isle. And Summer Isle is literally like a feudal fiefdom. And the lord of the manor runs the island. And because it's in the middle of the Gulf Stream, it's very verdant, and they grow apples and make cider and everything else as well. And Christopher Lee, the ubiquitous Christopher Lee, plays the Lord Summer Isle. And what happens is there is this Presbyterian Scottish police officer who is informed that a young woman called Rowan has been abducted and is somewhere on Summer Isle. And he goes over to try and find where Rowan is. Now, again, as an interesting aside, this film was such an influence on my sister that my sister called her daughter Rowan, based upon the character. And she called her child Logan. So obviously she has a thing about berries, maybe. Logan has disappeared, and the sergeant goes over to find her. Edward Woodward, who some of you may remember, probably few and less of you, but he played a role called Callan in a very, very popular TV series. And they, to cut a long story short, one of the things that is an interesting theme is you always, at the start of these things, you always have a kind of an opening sequence of somebody being lonely. They're outsiders in one way or another. And they have this wonderful sequence of him flying. I think he flies to the island, and you see him flying over alone on the plane. And you quickly realise that what he thinks is happening is not happening at all. And that there is this cult. And the cult itself is far more, it's really pagan. And there's paganism going on everywhere, and there's free love and everything else, which means you actually root for what technically are the bad people. But because they are so likeable in what they do, and they drink a lot and everything, and they have fun, you don't really realise what's going to happen. And the ending is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And it ends very quickly. And you suddenly go, oh, wow, what was going on there. So check it out. So anyway, for now, I've done my time, as it were. So that's my chat for today, for number 2 in this series. I might continue with Hauntology next time, which will be in 2 weeks' time. But thanks for spending 3/4 of an hour or so with me, and I hope you found it of interest. And hopefully you'll let all your friends know about this, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.